Sessions to deal with the police department staffing deployment study. We're on the record, so if we could go around the table and have everybody identify themselves for the record. Chief, we'll start with you. You're on the far end.
Good morning, I'm Mark Mew with the Anchorage Police Department.
I'm Craig Fraser with the Police Executive Research Forum.
Paul Holden, Anchorage Assembly.
Chris Birch, Anchorage Assembly. Ernie Hall, Anchorage Assembly.
Dick Training Assembly.
Dan Sullivan, Mayor.
And then Dennis Jackson somewhere.
She's right. Jennifer's around here.
And
Novi is around here too. Mr. Mayor, who's going to be leading off for the administration?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Chief and Mr. Fraser will be doing the presentation, and then, of course, open it up for questions from the Assembly.
Well, if you want to go through your presentation first, then we'll open up for questions. That way we don't get you lost in the middle.
I'd like to begin by introducing Dr. Fraser. This is Dr. Craig Fraser from the Police Executive Research Forum. He's Director of Management Services for PERF. Been with PERF for 15 years. Has been a professor at 4 different universities and worked at 4 different police departments. I think I got those numbers right over the years. He is the primary author of the deployment study that we commissioned. Although there was a team of 4 or 5 people that worked with him. As you know, the study came out a few months ago. We asked for a little supplemental discussion, and so he's delivering that. And we've made a presentation to the mayor and the staff, but this is your turn to have a presentation and you're about to report and ask Dr. Fraser any of these questions.
Thank you,
With that, I
Chair.
will turn the floor over to, and I'm going to push the buttons on the laptop. I think I'm qualified for that. It may be challenging though.
One of the first things I'd like to say is that when we looked at this department, we focused only on staffing and deployment. But as a result of spending time with people in this agency, we think it's a very good police department. One of the things that was really nice is anytime we asked for information, we got it quickly, we got it in good formats. That's not always the case when we do studies like this. Over the last 15 years, I've probably been involved in 200 different police studies, so it's something that was very good. We think this is a good department that serves the citizens of this municipality very well. Chief, next. What we did is we were asked to look at staffing and deployment of the Anchorage Police Department. There were sort of 3 different models we were asked to look at. First one was, what would be optimal given the current characteristics with perhaps some enhancement? The second one, and I'll explain this when I get to it in just a minute, what would it look like if for patrol, 40% of the time was unobligated? I'll come back to those numbers in a minute and explain the way that we look at patrol time. And the final one is we're asked to look at sort of future, what would it be like if there were enhanced operations and a full implementation of a community policing problem-solving model. Because it was clear from what we were given to start with, that's the direction that the department wants to move in. So what would that particularly look like? So when we talked about the optimal staffing model, when we did the study, there were 374 sworn members of the Anchorage Police Department, 156 non-sworn. You will see that these numbers at any time will vary. There's a snapshot, there's always change, there are retirements, there are other sorts of reasons why those numbers change, but that was the key that we started with when we began the study. For the optimal staffing, which is pretty much the base plus positions we thought were needed. We thought there were needed some additional positions for span of control, for better supervision. There were some additional civilian positions we thought were important to provide more opportunities for people in a number of units to spend time on the street as opposed to doing administrative tasks. So we said the optimum change really was 16 additional sworn positions and 11 non-sworn to reach, with pretty much using the current base, an optimal staffing model. And in that key is how patrol time is used. This is really sort of a policy decision based on goals that a department and its municipality determines how do you want patrol officers' time used. In any department, as you're aware, the bulk of the people on patrol, they respond to calls for service, that is, people call and ask for the police to come to a particular location. Secondly, they do self-initiated activities, traffic stops, business checks, pedestrian checks. Lots of things an officer will do without being asked to do that by the citizen, but on their own volition. That's good policing, very proactive policing model. The third sort of thing that time is taken up is administrative activities. Sometimes there'll be meal breaks, report writing, other sorts of things that take time from those other activities. The current level, when we looked at it, 46% of the time was spent on calls for service, 15 on self-initiated, 13 on admin activities. This is in keeping with what we see in other agencies. There is no particular staffing model, there is no standard or benchmark across the country. It's really a local decision, it's a policy decision, how you want your officers spending their time. And this, the total amount of time obligated, that's accounted for, that is spent on those things, is 74% of this model, 26% on unobligated. That means officers are on patrol, they're using their senses to see what's going on, they're driving, looking for particular problems, but they're not checked off on one of those other three activities. And out of that unobligated time may be time that they spend talking to people, stopping to talk to people, businessmen, people in the community, and so forth. So it's that unobligated time that becomes a fairly important sort of thing. And this, again, is sort of the current situation. And again, we recommend some enhanced positions that is in the reports that you have. Now, the next model was one that was in the request for proposals. And we're asked to say, okay, if we take that unobligated time and increase it to 40%. Pretty heavy goal. This is not one we necessarily recommend, but it was something that we were required to look at. And our focus really was on how many people would you need. This requires a lot more people than currently there. An addition of 83 sworn, 19 non-sworn, some other costs that would be part of it. For example, a need to increase the number of dispatchers, because when you add 83 people to field, you've got lots of additional radio traffic going back and forth. It would also require some enhancements in terms of workstations in the dispatch center, a number of things that then go along with this increased number of people that is pretty heavy. And in this model, the time works out to, next slide, 35% of the time would be spent on calls for service, 14 on self-initiated, and 11% on admin activities. So this means that the total obligated time is now 60%, total unobligated time 40%, and that 40% is those kinds of activities that are talking to citizens, spending other sorts of time that is not formally accounted for. It's looking for other hazards, other sorts of things that when officers see, then they would change their time to the obligated time feature. Again, we thought this was a pretty heavy change, and it wasn't one that we were required to look at that through the proposal, so we did. But it's the next model we think for the future works for Anchorage, and this is enhanced operations and full community policing implementation. This model needs 50 additional sworn positions, 20 non-sworn positions. We see this occurring over time. This to us was a model that fully implements community policing, is something that is probably, given the budget constraints, you're probably 2, 3, 4, 5 years away. We were asked to look at what might this look like when things get better, when the budget when your budget improves, when revenues are in a better situation. So we're not proposing this as an immediate change. We're saying this is something that's worth working for over time, that does two things. It provides then a much enhanced community policing activity. It provides some support that we think the officers will need in the field as well. And the times work out here, 40% on calls for service, 15 on self-initiated, 13 on administrative activity. And you'll see the breakdown is 68 obligated, 32 unobligated. Now, within that unobligated time, the department probably should start to create a new way to account for what officers are doing, and that is a way to look at activities that might be considered community policing, whether it's going to a meeting of the neighborhood, whether it's spending time talking with people, but we think it's probably something that needs to be measured. And you would see that unobligated time decrease, but you'd see another activity there that would be community policing efforts. Now, under this particular model, there are a number of parts that we think were very important. Next slide. And these are the things, some of this can be done immediately. Some of these things will take time as there are increased officers. First of all, one of the important things is to create a system of beat owners. That is, officers that work the same beat over time and get to know the conditions on those beats, get to know the people in those beats, the people get to know them. In a true community policing model, there's a lot of community engagement where you've got this good relationship between people that live and work there and the officers that work there. And it should be across time, that is, across the shifts. So the same officers work there on midnight, on swing shift, and on day shift. And the way the department is currently structured on a 4-10, that is, they work 4 10-hour days and then 3 off, you would then create sort of 2 squads. That you've got 6 officers that form this cross-time team. Those that work half the week, those that work the other half the week. You've got time for them to work together on that overlap day. And you are really trying to get more beat-specific information. So if I'm off, when I come back, somebody knows what's going on while I've been off. You want them to have limited out-of-beat assignments. This has some repercussions in the way the dispatch works. So that if I'm in my beat and there's a call there, you try to get, it's non-priority, it's not high priority. You keep it until I'm free from something else. The idea is to create this sort of ongoing identity between officers and a particular beat. So that's creating a system of beat owners. Officers become an owner of that beat. They're the ones that, and they should be assigned over time, at least a year, ideally maybe somewhat more. So they really become, the community knows who their officers are, and the officers know who the people are. That both live, work, the businesses, the resources, when there are things that have to happen there. That becomes very important. Secondly is then the patrol supervisors, and this is why we have some recommendations for increasing supervisors. They become managers of a set of beats. They now know what's going on. They have some somewhat different responsibilities. They've got a little bit more responsibility, not just for being a supervisor and administrator, but a little bit more substance of knowing what their officers are working on in those particular beats. So that becomes an important part of it. Secondly, long range, we think that it makes sense for decentralization to occur along a north-south axis. The department already sort of has a north and south, but over time we think you decentralize the north and south. That may require some additional facilities. This is maybe 5 years out or thereabouts. It all depends, but it means then that there's some organizational structure changes we recommend, a series of different sorts of allocations of people. So you really sort of decentralize in Anchorage even more, taking ownership of geography, ownership of the problems of crime and disorder that occur in those particular areas, that then enhances the way the municipality is policed. We think it's also important, and this we think should happen sooner as opposed to later, is creating weekly community policing ComStat meetings. The ComStat model is one that uses information to do a better job in the short run of allocating officers to where problems are. So you know what's going on. It also, in its best iteration, not the New York City model, which was pretty brutal in many ways, but in a better model, it's information sharing, it's knowledge about what's going on. It says, we've got these problems, let's work to solve them. What do we do? How do we involve the community and help us solve this particular problem in this particular neighborhood? And that also means that some of the crime suppression units become restructured. So rather than independently targeting things that they see, they become integrated into the patrol response model. So if the patrol people identify problems, you use those special units, those crime suppression units, to help solve those particular problems. So they work a little bit differently. In the extended model, they don't work in a particular district or a division unless the commanders know that they're there, know what they're working on. It's a much more collaborative model than some agencies where people work and nobody knows exactly what they're doing. Now, this agency has already moved in that direction, so we don't see this as a dramatic change. We see it more as some fine-tuning that will enhance the ability to identify and develop solutions for community crime and disorder problems. Other sort of key recommendations, one of the units that's been very successful, we heard a lot of good things about, was the Community Action Policing Unit. But it's limited, it's small, it can only work in a couple different neighborhoods. One of our recommendations is that unit be expanded, so there's at least 2 groups of them to expand the good work that they do. They really get down and get to know what's going on in neighborhoods. We're trying to move the whole department that way. At the same time, there's a need for specialization, or officers are always going to be responding to calls for service, but by having a CAP unit a second CAP unit, there's even more ability to focus on neighborhood particular problems. We think there are some sergeants that need to be added to improve the span of control. We looked at a number of different places throughout the agency. If you looked at some of the staffing charts, there are probably a sergeant here, one here, a couple here. Patrol, I think we're looking at a total of between 3 and 6, depending which of those models that need to be added, to again provide better span of control, better supervision, better instruction of the officers, so you've got them in a number of different places. When we looked at detective productivity, we found that the number of cases assigned is relatively low from some places we've seen, and a lot of cases get no follow-up at all. That is, if it doesn't look like it can be solved, it sort of gets set aside without callbacks to the victim. So part of our recommendations are you could reduce detectives somewhat, or you can take detectives and have them do things that are more productive. Calling on every case that comes in, that victim. Two things that happen. One, it lets people know that the department really does care about their victimization. It does, but it's even better when they get a call. Secondly, lots of times those cases, when you call them back, the victim may remember something more. They may have property that they've identified that can help lead to a solution. So there's a good investigative follow-up, not only from the idea that the department's concerned about the crimes, but also that it's concerned about getting more information that can take some of those cases that go into that. And we also looked at some of the scheduling of detectives, the way that that might be considered in the next contract negotiation we thought was fairly important as well. And then we looked at the need to add some civilian positions in some of the units, some of the specialized units, as much as anything, because without a good high-quality aide or clerk in those units, you've got sworn people doing a number of administrative tasks that you'd rather have a civilian doing because they're cheaper, especially if they're well-trained. You want that, that's a part of it. But then you get the officer, and his or her time is spent on the street or in the field as opposed to at a desk manipulating numbers or putting reports in the system. And that's really pretty the highlights of what we looked at, and I'll be glad to entertain questions or things that you want to ask about as part of this.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Just for the record, Harriet Drummond's joined us. Going to Paul and then Jennifer.
In fairness, I think Jennifer had her hand raised.
Oh, that's all right. We can start with that.
Well, thanks, Dr. Fraser, for your presentation. Just for disclaimer, you might remember I introduced myself to retired from Anchorage Police, and so I have a lot of knowledge, particularly community policing. Worked in a community action policing unit in Mountain View many years ago. There were 15 people in a concentrated area, a sergeant and 14 officers. It worked quite well because you were able to do just the things that you described with a concentrated, heavy intensity, concentrated number of officers. Some questions that come about is, one is, does your agency, PERF, account for, particularly in the area of detectives, and I noted that, I'm going to go to the area of cutbacks or assignments for detectives. I think you hit on that even at the end. Do you account for the uniform crime reporting, Part 1 crimes, particularly sexual assault, crimes against children, when you're making recommendations to reassign, say, 1 or 2 detectives from either of those units back either to patrol or another detective unit? And the reason I ask that is I'm not sure if you've checked. So I guess the quickest question is, do you guys account for that when you make recommendations to?
We do, because what we look at is we look at, by each of those particular units, the amount of time it typically takes to do a thorough investigation. And it varies from unit to unit. Obviously, if you're looking at crimes against children or special victims, many of those cases take greater sensitivity and take more time than, let's say, a robbery or maybe a burglary investigation. So that gets factored into our recommendations. We looked at the number of detectives assigned and the workload. And the workload is important to understand that it varies by crime type, but also by how difficult the case is. Typically, there are what we call contact-only cases, and we have benchmark numbers for those, how much time that should take. Then there are cases that are typical, those that are the sort of normal cases. Some are very complex that require more effort, and we look at those as well as another way of figuring out the workload. And then finally, those that are relatively simple. So we factor that into looking at the time needed for thorough investigations by crime type and by the difficulty to solve it.
And I appreciate the remarks and comments. What I was getting at is, I don't know if you really noticed, but as you described the policymaker decision on what amount of monogamy at a time, what will the community support, what will the assembly help fund, what was the mayor's and administration position. But crimes against children and particularly molestation and sexual abuse as well as sexual assault tends to be per capita in Anchorage and in Alaska, either number one or number two historically for a decade or better. And I'm not real sure I could justify moving a detective from either of those units on a number of workload per se, so.
And that becomes another decision for this group. So we're looking at the workload that's currently being recorded. We're not necessarily looking at what you might do if there's additional tasks you want them to perform beyond what they're doing now.
Right.
Because we do recognize those are very sensitive issues, very important issues, and as a policy decision, the Assembly might decide, you know what, we're not going to go just on workload. We want them to expand their capacity to move in some additional areas. And in our report, I think there's some areas we recommend that they expand if it's not just going to be a workload determination.
And then the other real quick question, I know I got a couple of other share some time. Does your agency account for the numbers that you've suggested to increase if you were to do certain percentage on obligated patrol time? Things such as lost time per employee, for instance, workers' comp, illnesses, long-term
Yes.
leaves,
Yes.
Army, military,
Yes.
reserve.
It's what we call the show-up rate. So what we do is when we're looking at staffing, if you, let's say, and I don't remember the number here, I want to say it was something in the vicinity of 75%.
Yeah.
Of those scheduled to come to work, already taking out those off days, what percent of those typically show up? And here it's about, I think it was 75% if I recall right. That means if I want 6 people there, I have to assign 8. So we do take that into account both on detective staffing as well as on patrol staffing. So we build that into the models that we develop.
And then lastly, and then I'll yield this, do you recommend a reorganization to the beat system management for the detective section in the future? Do you see that model? Because we've experienced that here at this department in the past, and we had some problems with it. It created, you talk about communication, you had a burglar or a robber working across the city, and we had different beats, different detectives from different beats that weren't able to communicate and find that they perhaps might be responsible for 10 or 12 robberies or burglaries, and yet there's only 2 in the east and 2 in the north in Eagle River and 3 in the west, and there was a lot of problems in the communication. So
No, sir, we don't recommend that. That's not been in our report. I think part of the thing that we feel strongly about those, there needs to be enhanced communication. That's through a ComStat, community policing ComStat model.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Jennifer?
Just for my own information, we were sold the 410s is really the efficient way to go. Do you feel comfortable that that's the way?
We do. There are a number of advantages you gain from that, at least for patrol. Now, we do have a recommendation that when contract negotiations come up, that needs to be looked at for investigators, for detectives. Because there's some difficulties with cases not getting assigned for 3 days or maybe longer because of the weekends off and that sort of the way some of those major detective investigative units are staffed. So it's not something we necessarily recommend, but based on some of the things we saw about detective assignment and detective caseload, our recommendation is consider that when negotiations come up again to see if in fact that makes sense for detective assignments. But from a patrol perspective, we think it works well, especially when we're talking about a cross-time team. The nice thing about a 410 is it means in 24 hours, you've got 30 hours of coverage. You've got 3 officers working 10 hours, so you got 30 hours for 24. And in a community policing problem-solving model that is what you all want to move to, it gives you overlap so the officers can talk to each other. The daytime guy can talk to the evening shift officer about things they're seeing. There's enhanced communication. The evening or swing shift officer can talk to the graveyard officer or the midnight officer. Again, what are you seeing? What's going on? So there's some ways that really sort of enhances that particular model, especially in the patrol side.
Go ahead, Jennifer.
And then you suggested a north-south division there. When you're looking at that, are you looking at it just as the policing, or is there added administrative cost to that, or duplication of administration? We always get a little nervous about that.
I think there's a little bit of additional management, but we think it's important that there's that geographical identification. There are some other perhaps organizational models the department may decide to pursue. What we looked at when it's fully set out, that there is a deputy chief for north, one for south, or assistant chief? Deputy chief, one for north. I sometimes get confused because we work in enough different places, sometimes the terminology varies. But the ideal organizational model from our perspective is you then have a deputy chief for North, one for South, a deputy chief over investigations, and then a senior civilian administrator over most of the support functions. So we're not looking at expanding the number of sworn ranks. But that provides a real focus on the identity on geography, which means you have that focus and people there know, I go to that person if I'm dissatisfied with what I'm getting, or here's how I make sure I'm accessing police services at its utmost.
And then I have kind of a personal question because you're an authority and I'm just curious. It used to be when there was a car accident, there'd be one policeman that would come and help you and you put flares all around it. And we seem to have gone to a model where we have, instead of flares, we have other police cars. Is this something that happens around the country? Is it something?
See, we didn't see that necessarily changing, I mean, because we looked at where things are now. Crash investigations probably vary from place to place. I'd have to defer to the chief on that one.
I don't think we have that model. I think it's people misinterpreting what those cars are doing. I'm not saying that there's sometimes that we don't have multiple units show up at a scene, but I keep hearing that story, and I think there are probably other reasons for why those cars are there. For instance, this is all, it generally doesn't take but one person to do a non-injury accident.
Yeah.
Put out a flare pattern, you do it. But if you got warrants, if the guy bailed out, he's running in the woods, the second car might be a canine that's chasing him while the first guy is doing the accident report. You know, I mean, there's a number of reasons why you could have more people, but a straight up non-injury accident, I don't think.
Actually, it was an assembly member that rolled a car.
I'm telling you, something's unusual about that.
It could also be that somebody else needs to direct traffic too. Somebody, the second officer may need to direct traffic around that crash scene.
Maybe it's because it was you, they wanted to make sure you were
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Chris?
Personal. Well, first of all, I wanted to thank you, Dr. Frazier, for your presentation and overview here. One question I had is, in looking for efficiencies, there's where do we stand in the kind of the broad spectrum of, you know, contracting for non-core services? Or, you know, obviously the high value component there is our trained sworn officers. That's a high value component. And any, you know, at least in my view, anything you can do to free up that time and availability is good. In other words, you know, maybe, you know, writing parking tickets isn't the best use of that resource.
And that's why we recommended pushing that to the non-sworn CSOs.
Great. Do you see any other aspects of that where any other aspects in the either sworn or the non-sworn side where you can, you know, administrative type things that you can push down and kind of free up that
The department's already done a fair amount of that. When we looked at some of the administrative jobs, if you look at the sort of recommended organization, there are some sort of individual people that there are probably too many direct reports to the chief. So we looked at consolidating a number of units. And once those are done, you may find that there's the ability to fine-tune more of those administrative efficiencies. But by and large, without major changes, in some places, and let me give you an example, what we didn't see here that we've seen some other places. Sometimes when it looks like there's a need for a higher proportion of additional detectives, we will recommend, rather than hiring full sworn people and making them detectives, you create a system of investigative aides. A civilian that can work inside, does a lot of the phone calls, does a lot of the follow-up work on computers, does a lot of the paperwork, and often we've seen some agencies who retire police officers from those positions. It's a very effective way to do that. The idea of getting the detectives out in the field, looking for suspects, talking with people, spending more time working on solving the case from a field work standpoint rather than an office work standpoint. But because here, we thought that the current detectives are more than adequate, we're looking at enhancing the productivity of the current detectives as opposed to adding investigative aides. So that's not something we saw that was necessary here.
Okay, and just if I might, on metrics for success, do you look at conviction rates? Do you look at how solid the I mean, all indications I have is that we have an extraordinarily good track record in getting convictions on arrests and the follow through. Are there benchmarks or ways of evaluating that?
That sort of depends from agency to agency, I think. What we did look is our concern was more the workload that's currently being performed by detectives based on what we've seen other places. So that's why the workload model, we used benchmarks. We've looked at probably 20 different specialized detective studies where we developed the benchmarks from a wide range of agencies for the amount of time that should take. And again, that's that thorough case investigation that we were pushing. So thoroughly is something that can be taken to the prosecutor, or there are no more leads to follow up. You're at a dead end. So that's what we did. So we didn't look at specifically conviction rates because that was not part of our scope, but clearances and convictions are some of the things that you want to look at to see how successful your detectives are.
And lastly, if I might, a question I've kind of run into is just, we have a lot of jurisdictional. We have, got J-Bear, we've got the Joint Base Elmendorf Richardson out here, and they're pretty well contained for the most part. But we also have state troopers that patrol the area that Jennifer and I represent. South Anchorage is largely patrolled by state troopers, and actually state troopers have some of the state highway system inside. And then the airport. Do you look at, I don't know, is that unique, or do you have a lot of those jurisdictional
It's
overlaps?
common in some ways. Here you're simplified because there's no county sheriff.
Okay.
So in some ways, you do look at some of those special police agencies that have a particular sort of thing. One of the things we were not asked to look at, so we didn't. The issue is, why do you have the state police patrolling part of the municipality? That's historic, perhaps, but we weren't asked to look at that or look at the workload there versus what would happen if the city were to expand to take that over, what those circumstances. That's not something that was part of our scope in this particular study. But having multiple agencies with some responsibility, that's typical. But as I said, at least here in Alaska, you're without one layer, and that's the sort of county sheriffs that sometimes are part of it in a lot of the rest of the country.
Thank you.
Chief, is there anything you want to add to this?
I think that I'd like you folks to know that when we asked for the 40% unobligated time, I think what we learned is that we overshot there. I don't know that we're ever going to get there, at least anytime real soon, but I think we are comfortable looking at the 32% unobligated time model. That was part of what we wanted the clarification for, and they've delivered it in their supplement. That will wait for a time when we can grow a little bit, but I think it's achievable, and I think with that 30% unobligated time, we can do a lot of proactive community policing activities, problem-oriented policing activities, Sarah model type of stuff that we really want to get into. So we think that's why we spent so much time wrestling with the unobligated figure. I think the 13% administrative time was much lower than it was when we had the IACP study, so we're really happy about that. That meant something to us.
The IACP is the International Association of Chiefs of Police.
That was the study that came out in about 96 or thereabouts. So I think we're poised to have a model that we're going to have to phase ourselves in. It's what can we afford to do and when can we afford to do it. But I think much of this study is we're poised to take on. I saw somebody here a minute ago seemed surprised to hear Dr. Frazier say that we had a 75% show-up rate, but I think from what I remember reading in the report, that's actually pretty good.
It is.
And the show-up rate has to take into account as people sometimes are on leave, sometimes they're sick, but a lot of time they're in court, or they're in training, or they're down at the station, downloading their video and collecting their evidence for trial the next day. It doesn't mean that they're not doing anything, but sometimes they're not on the street. So I don't know that that's out of line industry-wide.
Thank you, Chief. Paul?
A couple of things to comment there, and I appreciate the reports and the comments from the chief here. I think Jennifer, just anecdotally, and I think you can actually go to many studies and find that across the country, probably about half of the fatalities of police officers across the country are as a result of traffic stops and traffic collision investigations when they're out and about. So it creates a high rate of both long-term injury and some death as a result of it, not necessarily at the hands of an assailant. The other thing is troopers really only cover from about McHugh Creek to Girdwood. So APD handles the hillside and pretty much all proper MOA. When I hired on, it used to be an argument that anything south of Tudor Road on the highway and anything from Boniface out towards Eagle River and the Glen, all the highways were troopers, and then they handled the state agents, entities, and MOA. We took the hands-off approach there, and it kind of bounced back and forth, and they're pretty much largely gone. So added to the fact there are no counties and sheriffs, there are no concurrent cities. Palmer and Wasilla are 50 miles that way, and Hope doesn't have a police agency, and so we go quite a ways still before we get to another police agency. So there's a number that comes into play when you, probably other agencies, Dr. Frazier might be able to attest to, that have adjoining cities, that when you make a left turn, you're in one city, you make a right turn, you're in another. And you have police agencies both kind of backing each other up, mutual aid and all that sort of thing. We just don't have that fact with airport police and university campus police and the military bases. More often than not, it's APD going to assist them as opposed to the other way around. And so it creates a whole different number. And I personally, I think that 82 number at the 40% unobligated time is a realistic number that gets us to community policing. And I'd love to see us head that direction. And, you know, to me, sooner the better, but we certainly have to work within our constraints. So I think that's about it, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Harry, do you have any questions, ma'am?
Not right now.
Elby?
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chris?
Yeah, I just, anecdotally, I'd be interested in your perspective on two areas that I've always been interested in, is GPS in municipally owned vehicles. You know, every municipally owned vehicle, I'd be interested in your perspective on GPS and patrol cars as far as monitoring the location, you know, where those assets are deployed. And then secondly, your thoughts on patrol cars for personal use. In other words, you know, where they're basically deployed out at an officer's residence, if you will. And that comes up periodically. I was just interested in your perspective.
This is not part of the scope of the study, but
Right.
I'm here, so.
I thought we'd take advantage of that.
The GPS systems that are being integrated into the computer dispatch systems really enhance the ability to respond quickly to high priority calls. But there are very few high priority calls. And it's important that you wouldn't necessarily, here's the sort of counter to that. Even if some other officer is closest, in the beat ownership model that we're recommending, you still want to hold that call, if it's not a high priority call, for the beat officer. Even if somebody else might be closer to that. Because every time that officer responds to a call on his or her patch, they get more information, more knowledge about what's going on in their particular area. So if you're looking at creating a really limiting response time to those high priority absolute emergency calls, the GPS system is a wonderful tool to have. But if you let that then drive the dispatch responses to those low priority neighborhood kinds of calls, then you've taken something out of the beat ownership model. So pluses and minuses. On agencies that, and there are a number of agencies across the country that have take-home car programs. In most instances, if you can get past the cost, the capital costs of the initial purchase, most every study I've seen shows that over the long run, cars last longer, you spend less on maintenance and upkeep because officers tend to take care of their office, if you will. But it's really a question of the restrictions you put on, how they use them when they're off duty, the whole series of different issues that get into the rules and regulations. But from a strict cost standpoint, the difficulty is it's very hard sometimes to come up with the money to buy that many cars at one time. But from, as I said, from all the cost studies I've seen, it pays in the long run. But it's that short run cost that really is difficult to overcome.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman.
Ernie, any questions? No. Jennifer, anything else? Looks like, yes, Harry.
I was thinking in relationship to what you just said about the high priority calls and waiting for the beat owners to make those responses.
None of the high priority ones.
Any call.
Okay.
Any call. Is it harder to train the citizens to be patient, to wait for the beat owners to show up? Because I know I have, my citizens, my constituents have concerns about response time. And of course, everybody thinks their problem is the highest priority there is.
I think what you do, it's something that has to occur over time. There is a way to educate people about getting better service from their beat officer than they get from somebody that just comes in, takes the call, and then leaves again. And as much as anything, the real training needs to come in with the call takers. It's the expectation that is put into the mind of the citizen when that call taker is talking to them. Now, that may at some point require additional call takers. It depends on how much time they have to work with sort of a triage of the people that call. Systems that have worked well, call takers will first of all ask, is this an emergency call? And that's one of the first questions, because if it's an emergency, you're going to respond to it very, very quickly. That puts it in that high priority category. If it's not, there's the ability sometimes to take those calls over the phone, to take other ways to respond to those calls rather than sending an officer immediately. And sometimes in some places, depending on the sort of transition period, you could give that citizen a choice. Do you want an officer within the next 15 minutes? Now, most people will accept that they don't need somebody there immediately, but they need to know with some certainty how long it's going to take. And that means that that call taker has to be able to look at the screen and say it's going to take that long to get somebody there. Or can we have your beat officer, that's important the way you phrase it, your beat officer come talk to you about that with a little bit more time. So yes, there are issues there, but they can be overcome with good training and education, both from the citizen standpoint, but also from the call takers, and even how officers deal with it when they get through too.
Great, thank you.
Mayor's got a comment, Mr. Mayor.
Well, thank you. I just want to thank you for the presentation and for coming back to visit us. I just want to make sure that as we leave here that there's not, I guess, anticipated outcomes that really, I guess, aren't realistic. And Paul had mentioned he'd like to see us get to the 82 officers to get to the 40% unobligated time. That really is not a realistic number in your assessment. And
It's a realistic, well, again, I don't know your financial situation because that wasn't part of, well, I do know somewhat about your financial situation, but I don't know anything in terms of detail work. That was not necessarily what our recommendation was. That was something we were obligated to look at. Our recommendation for the future is moving to that enhanced operations and full community policing implementation model, which, Chief, if you go to, was the, next one, this one. This one, and if you go back one in terms of the numbers, this is really what we were asked to, what should be the future? This is the one we're recommending for the future that we think will stand well for the citizens of Anchorage, because it allows for the full implementation of community policing. It enhances operations. It's sort of in between the two, but this is the one that we thought best fit Anchorage. I can see the value of moving to that 40% unobligated time, but we think this is what should be the short term, and your budget is really going to drive what's short term here. But this is, I think, the one we would recommend most.
thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions, Paul?
Yeah, just two things. Number one, the home car program, I think one additional thing probably wouldn't address is the fact that the police car is like a billboard in the neighborhood. And I'll tell you specifically, in over 20 years in my neighborhood and subdivision, we had no reported burglars. At one point, we had 4 officers and a trooper with marked vehicles parked in a driveway. And I'm talking that over about 2 different subdivisions, about 20 blocks. Since then, either yours truly retired, another one retired, another guy moved to another neighborhood, a trooper moved to another neighborhood. In the last 6 months, we've had 3 burglaries in those same 2 subdivisions. And that is over a 20-year period. So these are billboards that saying, hey, we got law enforcement in the neighborhood. That's an added value that you can't put a dollar figure on, except for when you start seeing losses. And then the other thing is that, you know, whether we use this model here at 32%, I believe it was, or 38%, or the 40%, I think when you add in the complexities, as kind of stated earlier, we don't have, if you really want to have an officer working a beat and taking ownership of a call and trying to work the case to the extent full as possible, you really need that extra time, you need those extra personnel, simply because you don't have those concurrent extra resources that you can call upon at other agencies in the jurisdiction. You just don't. So we're different.
Thank you, Paul. Chief, you've got a comment?
I just clarification for Mr. Birch. I couldn't tell from his question that you wanted us to acquire GPS or didn't like it, but you should know that we do have it already.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Well,
Well, I'd like to see GPS on every piece of rolling stock the municipality has.
We've had it since 2003,
Okay.
and there's a period of time in this last year when it was down for a while. We had some compatibility problems with CAD, but we're solving that, and we'll be back. If it's not up now, it'll be back up.
So basically, you can map out the position of any piece of.
What we can't do yet is shift that out to units in the field, so they can see who's around them. We have bandwidth concerns there. But in dispatch, we can tell who's where.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ruben, for being here. We appreciate your next work session starts in about 8 minutes.
Did you know that?